Hello everyone, and welcome to the 71st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our patron pick for March 2022, Andrew Ryan from the Bioshock series. A self-made industrialist with a grand dream of a society free from the limitations imposed upon him by the power structures of mankind, Andrew Ryan serves as a shadowy antagonist throughout the first Bioshock game, a man at the helm of a once prosperous city that's begun to decay under the weight of his own ambitions. In this video, we're going to explore the conditions that led to the degradation of Rapture, the inherent flaws present in Andrew Ryan's character, and the system he implemented that led to the collapse of his utopian dream, not long after it became a reality. To accomplish this, we're mostly going to be looking at the information about Andrew and Rapture that were given in the first game, as well as the novel, Bioshock, Rapture. And while it does contain a couple contradictions in its story, it does serve as a worthy addition to this series, one that gives us quite a lot of useful information to examine when looking into Andrew's character. But before we begin, let's first talk about our sponsor for this video, Keeps. Keeps is an affordable online subscription service that offers clinically proven treatments designed to fight against the symptoms of hair loss. Chances are, you or someone you know has experienced some form of hair loss, as 2 out of 3 men will unfortunately experience hair loss by the time they turn 35. But where there's a will, there's a way. And if you or someone you know is in the initial stages of hair loss, Keeps is here to help. Their name is no accident, as Keeps is specifically formulated to help you keep the hair you have and stimulate the growth of hair that's beginning to fade. But don't just take my word for it, as there are testimonies from thousands of customers who have found success in combating hair loss with Keeps. Success that you can see in before and after pictures that are on your screen now. With the help of Keeps physicians, you'll choose products and treatments that are specific to your hair without ever having to visit a doctor's office or pharmacy. Their products are delivered straight to your door. And for any and all needs regarding Keeps, you have access to 24/7 support that includes a network of medical advisors, prescribers, and care specialists that are ready to assist you. Don't let your follicle insecurities rule your life, as hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order of this life-changing product, head to keeps.com/vile or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/vile to start restoring your hair today. Thank you, Keeps, for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The name Andrei Ryanovsky, a child born in the first decade of the 20th century in a village outside of Minsk, in Belarus, which was then a part of the Russian Empire. When the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917 after the October Revolution, Andrei and his father fled their home country, fearing the terror that was the new repressive regime that had forcefully taken the reins of power from a brutal, autocratic empire. During their flight, young Andrew would unfortunately bear witness to the deaths of his aunt and uncle, who were also trying to flee the country, watching as they were gunned down before his eyes as they attempted to board a train to Constantinople with Andrew and his father. This experience caused Andrew to harbor a deep-seated hatred for the Bolshevik government, a hatred that managed to supersede the ill feelings he had towards the previous regime due to his first-hand experience with the brutality of the new. Wishing to afford themselves better lives, Andrew and his father fled to the United States in 1919, seeking the freedom and prosperity that so many others had encountered there. It was here that Andrew gained his first taste of a better life, a life that was created by great men that had laid the foundation for a society dedicated to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. A new world where one could prosper simply by exerting their will upon it and manifesting their desires through their own determination. And in the light of this comparative paradise, Andrew Ryan prospered, exponentially so, after oil was found on his property, a fountain of wealth that he took from to sow its riches elsewhere, wisely investing his money in several different business ventures, namely his own company, Ryan Oil, the coal industry, and in the railroad system, eventually acquiring the second largest railroad in the country for his own, ventures that left Andrew one of the richest men in the country. Yes, life in America was indeed fruitful for Andrew Ryan, and his faith in the country that had made this life fruitful stayed with him until a new administration that stood in stark contrast to his personal ideals formed in Washington. You see, Andrew's experience in his home country had scarred him to the point where he absolutely distrusted all forms of government and the people that they were made up of. And from that scarring came ideas and observations that would shape Andrew Ryan into a man totally dedicated to self-determination and free will. Through years of exposure to many different aspects of the world, Andrew came to the conclusion that there was one thing underpinning every power structure in the world that served as the source of all the misery that had been or will be inflicted upon the human race: altruism. For those unaware, the simplest definition of altruism is the belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others, which would make each and every one of us an altruist to a certain degree, as I'm sure everyone watching this video cares for at least one person in their lives in a selfless way. On an individual level, I doubt that Andrew has a problem with a person adhering to altruism, as one can't be a parent or a lover without being altruistic in some way. But what Andrew is vehemently against is a concept that we're all familiar with, the greater good. Andrew Ryan doesn't believe in a greater good. He doesn't view the world or the people in it as a cohesive society whose interests are best served when we all work together to make the world a better place. So much so that when the government of the United States requested that a forest he owned be nationalized, Andrew burnt it down so he could prevent what he calls the parasites from prospering off of what he believed was rightfully his and his alone. No, Andrew Ryan believes in the individual, the will of man, and his ability to create for himself anything that he so desires. And it's through this will and this ability that Andrew believes society should be structured, that the freedom to do as one pleases and seize what one desires be unregulated and unhindered by any laws, morals, or obligations imposed upon them by others. Now, Andrew and his ideals draw heavily upon the novel Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, specifically a character in that novel named John Galt, a man who convinces the elite of the industrial world to retreat to a safe haven known as Galt's Gulch, a place where they'd be free of the repression of regulation so they could operate according to their full potentials. However, Andrew's character isn't an exact mirror of Galt's, nor is he a true representative of Ayn Rand's philosophy. Instead, his beliefs present themselves as a mix between Rand's philosophy and the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll talk about the Nietzsche aspect of Andrew's philosophy a little later on in this video, but let's talk about Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand before we continue any further. Now, Ayn Rand's philosophy is known as objectivism, and I encourage you to read Atlas Shrugged, The Objectivist, or any of her other works to get a better understanding of objectivism. But for the purposes of this video, a short summary which lays out 5 core beliefs of this philosophy that we can find on AynRand.org will suffice. And those 5 are: follow reason, not whims or faith. Work hard to achieve a life of purpose and productiveness. Earn genuine self-esteem. Pursue your own happiness as your highest moral aim. Prosper by treating others as individuals. Trading value for value. Now, this certainly represents a good part of Andrew Ryan's own philosophy, but there are several things that he does in Rapture that directly contradict objectivism, and we're going to review those contradictions. But we first need to take a tour through Rapture and cover the events that transpire there to better understand how this philosophy relates to Andrew's. Now, Andrew had always held these ideals within him, but as time wore on, they only expanded to the point where he believed that there was no place on Earth where a man like him could be truly free. Nowhere in the world where a person could operate as they wish with impunity. And because there was nowhere to run, so to speak, Andrew felt that the only possible solution to these worldly issues was for a person to create such a haven, manufacture a new world, untouched by the creeping hands of overbearing authority. And so the idea of Rapture was born out of Andrew's experiences, including his flight from his home country and the aftermath of the October Revolution, FDR's administration, and his New Deal, the Second World War, and the one event that would hasten Andrew's desire to make his vision more than a fantasy, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before, Andrew had stewed in silence, envisioning a golden utopian city that seemed an impossible endeavor that was nothing more than a dream. However, when those bombs fell, something was born from Andrew's desire for freedom: fear. With knowledge of this horrible event, and more knowledge still that other countries in the world were attempting to build their own arsenals, Andrew foresaw the doom of humanity, a doom brought upon by his ultimate enemy, altruism, the desire to shore up the common good that led to nations protecting the majority at the expense of the individual. This terrible premonition focused Andrew's efforts entirely on seeing his dream become a reality, and though it might have seemed an impossible feat, Andrew was the type of man who believed in the will of man and the unlimited potential of that will, and there's no one's will he had more belief in than his own. So began the arduous task of building Rapture, a monumental endeavor that Andrew sought to carry out in secret, covertly recruiting engineers, architects, and laborers to build a massive city underneath the waves, untouched by the corpulent hand of the parasitic altruists who served as a plague on the surface world. And this is, as far as we know, the beginning of the evil that spills forth from the dream of Andrew Ryan. In the Rapture novel, we're privy to the way in which Rapture was built, a complex construction of buildings made of concrete infused with metal, and an intricate system of airlocks, drains, and piping systems that fuels this city through the power of a nearby volcano. A city with windows made with glass that was combined with metal, a substance that was specifically engineered to handle the weight of the tons of water bearing down upon them. These technological marvels are just that, marvels, but their construction came at a heavy price. Because this was an entirely new undertaking that no one else had ever attempted before, there were bound to be kinks of some sort, and those kinks came in the form of many, many deaths. The true number is never given to us, but it's highly likely that dozens died constructing Rapture. Now, the novel addresses this issue at a few different points, but where it really matters is when Andrew is speaking to Bill McDonough on the subject that few gargantuan undertakings that had been made a reality up to that point in time had been seen through to completion without some number of deaths occurring amongst the ranks of the laborers working on these projects. Which is true, and the example he uses here is that of the Panama Canal, a project that cost the lives of 25,000 men. But just because something is true doesn't make it right. And the fact that 25,000 men died to construct the Panama Canal doesn't mean we've taken that as the cost of doing business. Rather, over time, we've seen the error of misusing human lives in order to construct things, and we've taken steps to prevent unneeded deaths from occurring. Workplace accidents still occur all across the world, and workers are still abused to this day, but on the whole, we've markedly improved the way in which we handle massive projects like Rapture, and sending men to their deaths in order to fulfill the requirements of a project is no longer the standard or something to be looked over. Now, considering the time period which this story takes place, you could almost excuse the attitude Andrew Ryan has towards the deaths of his workers as being a common thing amongst industrialists. But everybody's doing it isn't exactly the best excuse for throwing away people's lives. And to add insult to injury, Ryan tries to calm Bill's nerves by ensuring him that they are taking safety precautions. But those precautions are only being used to protect the lives of skilled laborers, as if the lives of unskilled laborers somehow mean less. And unfortunately, in Andrew Ryan's eyes, they do. This would serve as an ill omen, a sign of the events that would soon play out over the course of Rapture's history. But before we get there, I think it's best that we discuss yet another decision made by Andrew that we can count as another harbinger, inviting certain misunderstood people to be a part of his glorious utopia. Andrew's philosophy gives him the inclination to gravitate towards people who show themselves to be full of strength and spirit, knowledgeable and talented men and women who have the potential for greatness, men and women who show that they have what it takes to act upon the will of man, inherent in their DNA. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but Andrew has the tendency to view the more negative aspects of a person's character as untapped potential when they show themselves to be the kind of person he likes to associate with. Take Sander Cohen, for example. Nearly every character in this story recognizes Sander as being a bit off, or downright creepy. Andrew does too, to a certain extent, but he sees him more as eccentric and misunderstood, a genius whose capabilities are being repressed by a society who doesn't understand him. And because Andrew believes in the unlimited possibilities in the world, he sees this as a crime against a person who's willing to exert his will upon the world and go beyond what others expect of him. But in actuality, he's a crazed psychopath whose worst impulses are being put in check by that very society, or more appropriately, the laws that threaten to imprison him should he act on his twisted desires. Much the same can be said for people like Dr. Tannenbaum, Dr. Suchong, and Dr. Steinman, three characters who were known in the outside world for either their unhinged minds or the horrid things they did to people. And this is yet another component of the evil of Andrew Ryan, as he's not just simply turning a blind eye to the barbaric practices of these people. He's looking at these actions and recognizing them as untapped potential that other men and women who cling to petty morality, as he calls it, are blind to see. Can murdering people and covering them in plaster to pose them as statues be seen as art? Sure. Can kidnapping people to experiment on, or using the poor as test subjects, be seen as necessary actions taken in order to further scientific progress? Of course. Can a doctor sedating a patient and carving up their face against their will be seen as much-needed experimentation in the field of plastic surgery that will help others perfect their craft? Why not? All those statements are true, but again, just because something is true doesn't mean it's right, and more importantly, just because you can justify something doesn't mean that justification is a good enough reason to allow these things to occur in our society, as doing so not only causes undeserved and unneeded suffering to others, but these actions also come with horrible repercussions that tear at the very fabric of society, a notion that, as we'll soon cover, proves to be true. As now it's time to explore this so-called utopia that Andrew Ryan, with the help of countless others, has willed into existence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this city is a technological marvel unlike anything the world had ever seen, and while the location and construction of this city play into its decline, it's more so the rigid top-down policies that Andrew implements in Rapture. The first of those policies ties into the secrecy of Rapture's construction, that being the decree that anyone who chooses to live in Rapture can never leave. This is an incredibly harsh restriction that comes with many ramifications, like never being able to see one's family or friends, never being able to see true sunlight, and giving the people of Rapture the sense that they're trapped in a posh undersea prison that they can never escape. And to make matters worse, all goods from the outside world are heavily regulated to the point where no one can enjoy anything they did on the surface unless Andrew Ryan gives the go-ahead. In theory, these policies, though strict, shouldn't have been an issue because no one came to Rapture without knowing about these policies. It wasn't as if they were surprised to find out they couldn't leave, or that their access to the outside world would be limited. Everyone was well aware of these rules, but what turns these policies into severe problems is the way in which Andrew structured this society. Andrew implemented the purest form of capitalism in Rapture possible, a complete and total adherence to the idea of laissez-faire market systems, one where no regulations or rules exist whatsoever, making it so the only limitations on the market within Rapture were created by the choices made by the people involved in the various businesses of Rapture. This left room for enormous potential and opportunity, as a market without limits allows people to do three key things when engaging in business ventures: take actions that are only limited by their imagination, take risks they wouldn't have taken otherwise, and reap the benefits of the hefty amount of upward mobility granted by such a system. A system that makes it so one good idea can potentially make a person wealthy overnight if they have the will to act upon their ideas. Now, at a glance, these ideas seem to be well in line with the principles of objectivism, but it's the way in which this society is structured outside the marketplace that has a severely negative impact on any of the potential upsides of such a system. Whereas a true objectivist system wouldn't shun morality or personal responsibility, the system of Rapture does. Take as an example an exchange we're given between Andrew and a couple of store owners in the novel: Gravenstein, who owns only his store, and Shep, who owns his store and controls the garbage business in that area of Rapture. Because he's the only one in that area who handles garbage pickups, Gravenstein is forced to use his services because he's the only one available. But because they own competing businesses, their grocery stores, Shep is charging Gravenstein 10 times the amount he charges others to pick up his trash to try and force him out of business. And when Gravenstein complains to Andrew, Shep reminds both of them that Rapture is a city fully committed to unregulated markets, and this is simply the market taking its natural course. This is true, but once again, it doesn't make it right. And more importantly, these practices aren't in line with the spirit of objectivism. Objectivism, without a doubt, espouses that a person's right to self-determination should be unhindered. But again, objectivism doesn't reject morality, as Andrew has. Instead, it rejects the legal imposition of restrictions on morality, not the individual's responsibility to contribute to society in a morally sound way. In a true objectivist society, business malpractice like this would theoretically be dealt with by the people, as people working and coexisting together in such a society would be the ultimate deciders of what's okay and what isn't. And again, theoretically, the behavior exhibited by Shep would be dealt with by the business community in some way, whether that be through boycotts or embargoes, who's to say. But in Rapture, the community isn't allowed to interfere with any business practices whatsoever. Rather, they're only allowed to attempt to edge out a business by creating a competing business of their own, so that the market will sort it out through competition. Andrew doesn't like Shep's business practices, but he defines his position on the matter by making this statement: "It's not really a business practice I admire, but the great marketplace is like a thriving jungle, where some survive and become king of their territory, and some don't. It's the way of nature. Survival of the fittest weans out the weaklings. Gravenstein, I advise you to find some means of competing or move out." The problem with this statement is that it doesn't account for Gravenstein's capabilities. He clearly isn't able to set up a competing garbage business with Shep, for various reasons, so why should he be made to suffer because of his inability to provide the capital or manpower to set up a competing business? This isn't an issue of regulation, this is an issue of morality. The only why here is for the sake of free markets and unhindered ambitions, which clearly leads to a paradox, because these completely unregulated markets allows the individual to impose their will upon others to the point where you could view some of the actions taken by others as repression and tyranny. And we can find even more of this type of repression when taking a look at the low-level workers of Rapture and how they're treated. Andrew severely underestimated the labor force that Rapture would need to employ to take care of maintenance, construction, and other low-level jobs. As Bill points out in the novel, the people they'd need to hire to fill these positions might not take too kindly to a world with no unions or guaranteed pay, and he foresaw problems rising up because of these factors, not to mention the others that we've already discussed so far. Imagine this. You're a worker who's given the opportunity to work in a utopian city where the rules are few and the potential for greatness is high. Upon arriving in this city, you learn that these numerous possibilities for advancement are in fact quite limited for those who don't have the skills or the financial means to engage in such endeavors, which isn't unlike the surface world. But here, you don't have any way to do anything about the conditions you're forced to work and live in. Instead, you're forced to work for others for whatever pay they deem suitable for your efforts. And if you can't figure out a way to get yourself out of that situation, well, tough luck. Only the elite or the skilled enjoy prosperity in Rapture, and the rest are left to fend for themselves under the weight of the freedom they've been promised. This doesn't sound like the makings of a happy and prosperous society. It sounds like a powder keg filling with gunpowder, waiting to be ignited by the tiniest spark. Andrew's willingness to ignore the suffering of others in favor of the freedom of an individual to do whatever they please without moral restriction is what I believe to be the Nietzsche component of Andrew's philosophy. Nietzsche was an advocate of an idea known as the will to power, which we're given a good definition of in his book Beyond Good and Evil. Anything which is a living thing and not a dying body will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living, and because life simply is will to power. Exploitation belongs to the essence of what lives, as a basic, organic function. It is a consequence of the will to power, which is, after all, the will of life. In short, the will to power is the energy that drives all life, the desire within every living being to acquire power, so to speak, power to enforce one's own will and advance one's own position on and within the universe. In the hands of Andrew Ryan, this philosophy is taken verbatim and used in the purest sense. Any living being that has the will to do something should be allowed to do so without restriction, and if consequences arise from their behavior, those consequences will eventually be dealt with by another being that's willing to surmount these issues, specifically through the opportunity to do as they please in an unrestricted and unregulated free market, which is how Andrew has fused the philosophies of Rand and Nietzsche to form a set of ideals that serve as a detriment to the utopian society that he wishes to create. With these ideas backing everything that he does, he leaves no room for compassion for your fellow man, or any sense of common morality that prevents others from exploiting those less fortunate than them, to the point where even concepts like charity are seen as a betrayal of mankind and a product of the evil that is altruism. This philosophy created that powder keg I mentioned earlier, and there's no better spark for such a fragile situation than a subversive element amongst the ranks of Rapture. That element, of course, being the career criminal, Frank Fontaine. The degradation of Rapture can't fully be blamed on Andrew, as Frank plays a large part in its downfall, and he can't even be blamed for allowing Frank into Rapture, as no amount of background checks could have revealed this man's murky past. But Andrew can be blamed for the policies he implemented that allowed Frank Fontaine to achieve a success in the first place. By restricting free trade and a person's ability to leave Rapture, he created a demand for contraband items that would inevitably be filled by a man like Frank Fontaine, which is ironic considering that Andrew responds to the increasing requests from people close to him to ban plasmids by stating that prohibition never works. Yet he himself implemented a policy of prohibition against outside items, creating the same kind of criminal enterprise that real-world prohibition created. By creating a hostile work environment for lower-skilled workers, Andrew created unrest and set the stage for a character like Atlas to rouse the people into revolting against their oppressive overlords. And by allowing morally backwards people into Rapture like Suchong and Tannenbaum, Andrew put them in reach of a power-hungry man like Frank Fontaine, a man who, like Andrew, was undisturbed by the experiments they were undergoing and used them to gain leverage over Andrew by creating plasmids, which would serve as the final nail in the coffin for Rapture. Andrew had allowed the manufacturing of drugs like cocaine in Rapture because to prohibit them would contradict his principles. The same reasoning applies to plasmids, except genetically modifying an entire population into veritable superhumans who are addicted to and dependent on these genetic modifications isn't exactly as innocent as letting someone indulge in a drug that puts a little pep in their step. All of these elements bring us to the final mistake Andrew Ryan made that underpins every single one of the policies he implemented and the decisions he made, and that's the fact that Andrew ruled Rapture as a dictator whose dictatorial power was derived from the freedom he promised to his populace. And as that freedom increasingly started to wear on the vision he had for his city, Andrew began to resort to tyrannical measures aimed at curbing the continued unrest in Rapture, first with his constables that were loyal only to him and his vision for the city, then with security cameras and turrets designed to deter any would-be criminals, followed by a political prison where he interred any and all citizens of Rapture who dared to think outside the lines that Andrew had drawn, and finally by seizing Fontaine Futuristics in a hostile takeover and sinking Frank and those loyal to him to the bottom of the sea in a department store prison. And all of this tyrannical overreach by Andrew comes as a direct result of the type of person he is. Andrew is a magnanimous man, a larger-than-life figure with innate charisma that draws people to his person, a man whose capabilities come from his own determination and will to achieve anything that he so desires. Some people are able to remain humble when they're gifted with these natural talents, but others still succumb to their own ego, and Andrew Ryan is definitely a victim of his own ego. Companies named after him, statues lining the streets of Rapture to show everyone his grandeur, designs created by him to specifically cater to his tastes, and a man who believes that it's his right to own and possess everything he's ever touched, even if those things were brought into existence with the help of those willing to work for him and his dreams. No gods, no kings, only man. That's the slogan that welcomes newcomers to Rapture, a promise that the world they're about to enter is one of freedom and prosperity, unconstrained by church, state, and your fellow man. But that banner is misleading. As if it were true to the spirit of Rapture, it should read, no gods, no kings, only Andrew Ryan, the God King of Rapture. By the time New Year's Eve of 1959 rolled around, Andrew was now firmly in control of the fates of the citizens of Rapture. Well, those who were loyal to him. And his society was beginning to crack as physical and metaphysical leaks in Rapture's hull began to form. And with all the negligence Andrew had displayed so far, it was always inevitable that such a grand utopian dream would crumble at his fingertips. By the time of Bioshock, Rapture had been reduced to a ruinous ghost of its former glory, and Andrew Ryan, an enigma locked away in the comfort of his industrious home in the heart of Hephaestus, waging a war of delusion against a man who seeks to turn everything he's built into his own personal fiefdom by using Andrew's own lab-grown progeny against him. Once our protagonist reaches his father, a showdown ensues where Andrew challenges his son to prove himself a man, not the slave he had been engineered to be by the traitorous Fontaine, but an individual with the will to resist the power imposed upon him by those that wish to exploit him. But in the end, Andrew's creations, Rapture, and his son proved to be his undoing. And at this end, who was Andrew Ryan? He was a man forced to experience misfortune in his youth, watching the horrors of the early 20th century world unfold before him. In viewing this misfortune, Andrew began to distrust all existing power apparatuses in our world as agents of altruism, an ideology that claimed to represent the good of the people, but one that, in his view, caused all the strife and misery that's been forced upon the human race since the beginning of their history. Fed up with the parasites of the world, latching onto his glory and claiming it for their own, he envisioned a world where no man would have to suffer under the weight of another's impositions. A world where their will to enhance their own lives and carve their own path would be unhindered by religion, law, and morality. Thus Rapture was born, a paradise that might have been a utopia if it weren't for the many shortcomings of this inherently egotistical man, a man whose willingness to provide unlimited and unregulated power to any person who chose to live in his city resulted in the torture, maiming, and deaths of thousands of individuals as his vision tore apart at the seams under a flurry of jabs resonating from the fallacies present within the system he had built. Who knows what could have happened had Andrew provided some baseline necessities for his society? I think most of us can agree, no matter your views on society or economics, that a lawless world with no courts, no accountability, no morality can't hope to persevere, even if those structures were to exist on a communal level. Andrew Ryan's vision for a utopian society of unregulated freedom is an admirable one. But no man-made construct is truly perfect, and like many other utopian ideals that have been put into practice in our own world, this one was doomed to fail for one crucial reason: the inherent faults present in mankind. And in this scenario, those faults presented themselves as an enormously inflated ego and unchecked selfishness, the core of Andrew Ryan that allowed evil to reign in Rapture without restriction. You could say that the evil that arose from the actions of Andrew Ryan weren't deliberate, that he never meant to be the indirect reaper of thousands of souls, but the fact remains that all the suffering that occurred in Rapture can in one way or another be traced back to Andrew Ryan. And it's for that reason that though his intentions may have been glorious, when put into practice, they resulted in a catastrophic amount of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Andrew? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, and to my patrons, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.